to the topic, in a very personal one. And then I'm going to ask our three panelists to introduce themselves and their organisations and explain why they take the positions they do on burning plastic and incineration in general. So my memory of this topic goes back quite a long time, to the mid-1990s, when Labour was in opposition but waiting to take power. And Michael Meacher was the potential environment minister, and he would talk about this problem of landfill. I can remember having lunch with him and talking to him about it, and he regarded it as a very difficult problem. And when he got into power and got into the environment ministry, he was very troubled by this. And I remember talking to him on many occasions about the difficulties of, where do you put rubbish? Do you put it into landfill, which has its own problems? Do you burn it? Do you try and recycle it? Recycling was the obvious one, and he was really in favour of that. But recycling levels at that time were terrible, and landfill was filling. So he made the very difficult decision to permit a network of incinerators around Britain. And that decision is what has probably set the stage for what we're seeing now, which is growing battles around the country, locally and nationally, over whether incinerators should be built. There's one just been constructed in South London, near to my home. I think it's Viridor in Beddington Lane. And people in that area are furious with it. But you can, alternatively, you can see that the local authorities in that area are struggling to find anywhere to put their waste. So this is a long-running problem, and it will probably run for a long time more. And what I'd like to do now is ask our panelists to set out their cases for and against incineration of waste, and particularly plastic, and the potential alternatives. So we're going to start tonight with Jacob Haler. And Jacob, I wonder if you could set the stage for everyone by introducing not just yourself, but your organisation, and, if you like, a brief history of where you are on this topic and how you got there.
Many thanks, Jonathan, for that introduction, and thank you for the Frontline Club for the opportunity to give the industry's perspective on plastic and energy from waste in particular. So I'm the Executive Director at the Environmental Services Association. So we're the trade body that represents the recycling and waste industry. So our member companies include all of the major players in the UK, so the operators of energy from waste plants, but we don't just do energy from waste. We cover the full spectrum of recycling and waste services. So we do the collections from households and businesses all around the country. We do the sorting of materials into different individual material streams. We do the processing. So, for example, we'll take plastic bottles and we will process those into pellets or flakes that can then be used as a raw input into other manufacturing processes. And for waste which we can't recycle, which is non-recyclable, we operate energy from waste plants, and we also do some landfill disposal. But as Jonathan was alluding to in his introduction, we've moved a long way in the last sort of 20 years or so away from what was predominantly a landfill-based industry. It's been EU targets that have driven us along that journey. Targets in sort of two principal areas. The first has been to boost recycling, to get our recycling rates up. There are targets for us to recycle 50% of our waste this year, and those targets are increasing. So even though the UK is leaving the EU, we are following, sort of matching the EU sort of target framework over the next sort of 10, 15 years, and we'll be boosting recycling even further. So one set of targets has been around recycling, the other has been around landfill diversion. So trying to get our non-recyclable waste out of landfill, and that has been an absolutely critical priority for the sector and for the industry to get stuff out of landfill. Now, we at ESA, we see our purpose as being to deliver a circular economy in the UK. So there are lots of different organizations that talk about a circular economy, that talk about the need to make better use of our resources, better use of our waste, maximize the value we get back out of these resources that are discarded. But our members are the ones that actually put the boots on the ground, they put the vehicles on the streets, they make the investments in the infrastructure to actually treat our waste materials and to recover the most value from them. We have three principal objectives as an industry, one of which is around driving higher standards, higher operational standards, higher standards in terms of protecting the environment. Our second objective is around working with the government and with other stakeholders, with NGOs, with other parts of the supply chain, to try and make sure that the policy framework maximizes the recycling and the recovery of our waste materials. And then the third of our main strategic objectives, which I think is perhaps the most pertinent for tonight's discussion, is all around decarbonisation. So meeting net zero is incredibly important to us, and I'd like to come on to that because I just want to make 3 points, if I may, in this sort of opening sort of statement. The first will relate to carbon, the second to air pollution, and then the third I'll try and talk a bit about plastics specifically. But Jonathan, you asked us to sort of set out what our position is on energy from waste and on burning plastic. From our perspective, as you might imagine, we're very much pro energy from waste. You know, that's quite straightforward. But at the same time, we are very anti burning plastic. We certainly do not want to be burning plastic. We want to keep plastics away from energy from waste plants. We want to be recycling those plastics as much as we possibly can, because you're right, you know, those plastics, that is fossil-based carbon, it's bad polluting CO2 that we do not want to be putting into the atmosphere. So that's absolutely fundamental. We want to be recycling plastic. We do not want burning it. So the 3 points I wanted to make. The first is around carbon. So I guess the context is, you know, as an industry, we are trying to maximize the recycling. That's what we're all about. We're trying to recycle as much as we possibly can, but we can't recycle everything. So, you know, we're getting close to that 50% recycling at the moment. We're going to try and boost that, our recycling rates as much as we possibly can, but there is a lot of stuff that's just not possible to recycle. So multi-layered laminates, materials, you know, packaging and products where you have lots of different materials stuck together, that is impossible to recycle. Also, just through the system, you get contamination. Different types of materials, when they get mixed together, they can contaminate each other and make it difficult to separate. That they then become impossible to recycle. So there is a good basis for policy coming forward. We're expecting new policy in the next sort of 2 to 3 years. There'll be new regulations that will be introduced that will help to incentivize the packaging industry and others to make stuff more recyclable, and that will be really important because it will help to boost recycling so that we can reduce the amount of non-recyclable waste that comes into the system. But that said, there is going to be, and for a long time there will be, non-recyclable waste, and we have 2 options for dealing with it. One is energy recovery and the other is landfill. And from a pure carbon perspective, energy from waste is a far better option than landfill. So for every ton of waste that we put through an energy from waste plant, it saves, figures I've seen, are around 200 kilograms of CO2, and if you'd sent that ton to landfill instead. So for every ton we're putting through an energy from waste plant, we're actually saving carbon relative to the alternative, which would be landfill. So energy from waste is far better from a carbon perspective. You know, we're very proud of our emissions record in the industry. We've reduced our emissions by possibly around 70% since 1990. I think that's what the Committee on Climate Change has quoted. And the vast majority of those savings have come from getting stuff out of landfill into recycling and into energy from waste. So that has been a really, really important move towards environmental improvement that we've made in the last 20 years.
Can I just give you 1 more minute?
Sorry.
Can you finish off in 1 more minute?
1 more minute. Okay, very quickly.
Back to all the points later.
So my other 2 points, air pollution. So these are amongst the most heavily regulated industrial installations in the EU and therefore in the world. Almost all the capital cost, huge amount of capital cost, it's all going into the pollution control to control the emissions that come out the top end. When you look at other types of air pollutants that come out of energy from waste plants, their contribution to overall air quality issues is minimal. It is somewhere in the region of 0.1 to 0.2% of the air pollutants that are commonly analysed. So they are very well regulated and they make an imperceptible contribution to air pollution. Third point then is around plastics. Well, I've already said, the importance about making sure that we recycle our plastics, and the plastics industry and the government are both putting in a lot of effort to reduce the numbers of different polymers, to rationalize things, to design stuff better, all of which will help to recycle more plastic and to stop it ending up in energy from waste plants, which we certainly don't want. How was that?
Thanks, Stephen. Can I just to clarify a couple of questions, which are hopefully very brief answers. The first one is, how many tonnes of waste are currently going into incinerators, and how many incinerators are there nationally?
So there are probably somewhere in 3 dozen, I would think. About 15 million tonnes goes to energy from waste plants at the moment. So DEFRA expects there to be, by 2030, 2035, there to be about 20 million tonnes of non-recyclable waste. So we've got 15 million tonnes of capacity at the moment, roughly. So we'll need about another 5 million, roughly, in order to make sure that we're not landfilling any of that non-recyclable waste.
Do you have any sense, do you know the CO2 equivalents emitted by those incinerators?
So, well, it depends on where you draw the boundaries around it. So I made the point that relative to landfill, you're saving 200 kilograms of CO2 for every tonne that goes to EFW rather than to landfill. So the point is, you have the gross emissions, but roughly half the CO2 is biogenic because it comes from bio-waste, and then it's the other half that at the moment comes from fossil-based stuff like the plastics. We want to get that down, but then you also have to think about the landfill and other things that are
just trying to get the number, basically.
Yeah, so I think in terms of net emissions, it's something like several hundred kilograms of CO2 per tonne of waste.
So that would take you to what, something like about 12, 11 million tonnes a year of CO2?
Ish, yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks. Now, you've had roughly 10 minutes, Georgia. Does 10 minutes sound good to you?
That sounds good, yeah. Thank you very much. My name is Georgia Elliot Smith. I'm a professional environmental engineer and a sustainability consultant in industry. I'm also a UNESCO Special Envoy for Youth and the Environment. Now, I'm also a member of Extinction Rebellion. I'm an environmental activist and an anti-incineration campaigner. So this position came about because I've been working, I started my career, as I say, as an environmental engineer in the construction industry, and very quickly came to see the vast quantities of waste that we were handling. And despite huge efforts on my part and on the part of my colleagues, we were unable to really make a dent in the amount of waste that was being produced and where it was really going. And the economics of waste are very complex and very difficult to change. And so I became very frustrated about this problem, and after many years of trying to fix it within industry, came to realize that the whole structure of policy, regulation and economics around waste is just broken. And having been to many energy from waste plants, waste processing places, various different waste processing routes, I actually then became an anti-incineration campaigner, and for the last couple of years I've been campaigning to prevent the expansion of a huge energy from waste, municipal waste incinerator in Edmonton, in the London Borough of Enfield. Now, through my work there, so through my background, as I say, in environmental engineering and waste management, then into my campaigning specifically against the Edmonton incinerator, I've learned a huge amount about the issues of waste incineration and the alternatives that are available. And I've actually become very shocked and very, very motivated and galvanized on incineration as a result. And then from that campaign, with the Stop the Edmonton Incinerator campaign, and with connection with groups like UK Win, as I say, Extinction Rebellion, and through my network with all of these groups, meeting lots of other anti-incineration campaigners, just came to realise the scale of the problem and the fact that all of us are fighting these incineration developments in our local areas. And so over the course of the last year or so, have become incredibly frustrated with being brushed away by local councils, our local MP, our various members of parliament who are supposed to be taking charge of these issues, and just getting brushed away by both the waste industry, the incinerator operators, and the representatives that are supposed to be stepping in. And so then decided actually there was an opportunity to take legal action, and now I'm working with a legal team. We've been participating in correspondence and have now filed papers at the High Court in a challenge against the Secretary of State for Bays and the devolved administrations of the UK government, to challenge them on the new UK carbon emissions trading scheme, which specifically omits waste incineration from its scope. So it includes things like aviation and manufacturing, but it omits waste incineration, which I believe to be a huge failure by the government to account for carbon emissions, a major carbon emitting industry in this country and in the rest of Europe. I can give you the figures on carbon emissions. I will do in a minute. I know them very well. And this legal action has come about because I have been so hugely disillusioned and frustrated by both the waste incineration industry and by local and national authorities and their lack of ambition, understanding and action on waste incineration. So to just give you an oversight about the legal case that I'm bringing, as I said, on the 1st of September, we filed papers in the High Court specifically against the UK emissions trading scheme proposals. So that policy was published on the 1st of June, and it was a paper called the Future of UK Carbon Pricing, and that document set out the proposals for the new UK emissions trading scheme, which has come about because we're leaving Europe. And so currently we're subject to the EU emissions trading scheme, and as of January next year, we're going to be subject to our own emissions trading scheme. But what happened is, despite having a couple of years to prepare that policy and to apply ambition and listen to all of the various different stakeholders, unfortunately it became a very unambitious and far too loose policy that I believe, and so do my legal team believe, is directly in contravention of the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement, of which the UK is a signatory, requires that we reduce CO2 emissions as quickly as possible in order to reduce catastrophic climate change and rising global temperatures. Now, by specifically omitting a major CO2 emitting industry from that emissions trading scheme, we are failing to regulate the CO2 emissions from that industry. And the reality is they're an enormous emitter. So there are currently 48 fully operational municipal waste incinerators in the UK. And the vast majority of incinerated waste in the UK, around 80% of it, is local authority collected municipal waste. We know from studies that have been done all around the UK, both by government bodies, local councils and campaign groups, that around about 60%, between 50 and 60%, depending on what you look at, of that waste that goes directly into the incinerator is, given today's current technology, common technology, fully recyclable or compostable. We're not talking about some woo-woo futuristic, you know, in another galaxy technology that is fully capable of being recycled using today's recycling technology. But because of the fact that our incineration is artificially cheap, that recycling technology is not invested in. So the reason it's artificially cheap is because if we go back to 1996, the UK introduced the landfill tax, which was incredibly successful. And almost overnight, you know, massively reduced quantities of UK waste going to landfill. So we used to send, pre-1996, we sent about 90% of the UK's waste to landfill. Today, that figure's gone down to about 10%. So very, very successful piece of regulation that has directly impacted the economics of waste and means that we no longer send waste to landfill in this country. However, all that has done is displaced a huge amount of waste into incineration. So within a few years of the landfill tax being introduced, recycling rates increased. At that point in time when it came in, only about 10% of waste was recycled. That increased very quickly over 10 years to between 30 and 40%. But in the last 10 years, recycling rates have stagnated at 40%. We have not managed to break through 40% recycling rate in 10 years. Now, that is because our rates of incineration are climbing. So I mentioned before that incineration is artificially cheap. The reason for that is they don't pay tax either as a waste disposal route, as landfill does. They also do not pay any tax for the carbon emissions which they create, which other energy generating industries like gas and coal have to pay. And so therefore they have a double benefit of paying no tax for disposing and no tax for emitting. And therefore what we've generated here is an artificially cheap waste disposal route, which is creating an enormous burden on society from its CO2 emissions. And also, I mean, despite what Jacob said, there is a hugely significant pollution impact, air pollution and also toxins going into landfill and to recycled products. So how am I doing for time? Sorry, I can go on about this.
Just about out of time.
Oh no, okay, well I didn't ask, pretend I didn't ask, give me one more minute. What I am going to say about the emissions is that I want to come back on the pollution from incineration, because that is not something that can be brushed aside. But what I do want to talk about is the CO2 emissions from incineration are enormous. About 60% of what goes into the incinerator is plastics, and therefore that quantity. So when you have a solid piece of plastic, whatever it is, that is stored carbon. That stored carbon, that obviously is plastic, it's oil that's come out of the ground and been converted into solid plastic. As soon as you burn that, you turn it instantly into atmospheric carbon, atmospheric CO2. That plastic should be kept in its form, recycled and kept inside a circular economy. In a climate emergency, it is simply not appropriate to be taking stored carbon, as in the plastic which is in our economy today, and turning it into atmospheric gas. That is just not appropriate. And so our understanding of the waste hierarchy, when we talk about landfill incineration, when we're talking about plastic, that's actually turned on its head, because plastic is not biodegradable and therefore does not create methane emissions in landfill. But as soon as you stick it into an incinerator, it creates carbon emissions, which cannot be captured and stored using today's technology. So,
Can I stop you there? Just one quick question, which is, if plastic is not to be burned and there's inevitably going to be some waste, the argument seems to be that it's an inert form of carbon and can simply be locked away in some form. Over years, how might we cope with what would basically be a plastic waste mountain?
So, I mean, the first thing we have, the first thing that we have to talk about is the fact that a vast quantity of entirely recyclable plastic is going into incinerators right now. And there is no municipal waste incinerator in the UK that conducts any form of pre-sorting before that waste goes into the incinerator. So what happens is all of the waste that goes in...
A slightly different point. I was just asking, you would end up with waste. What would you
Oh, of course. I agree that incineration is part of the waste hierarchy. It absolutely is. And there will always, I believe, unless a different technology takes over, I believe there always will be a tiny place for waste in the for incineration in the waste hierarchy. It's a fact. However, what is being incinerated today is not residual waste, and the waste industry makes a big point of this residual waste statement. What is being incinerated today is largely recyclable material. The future, I hope, for incineration is with the right economic instruments in place, incentives, grants, carbon regulation, that the tiny quantity of waste that genuinely cannot be processed in any other way would be incinerated. But equally, there should hand in hand be ambitious government regulation and controls that prevent non-recyclable, avoidable wastes from entering the waste stream in the first place. Because at the moment we get all kinds of weird and wonderful mixed materials entering the materials stream that can't be recycled. But that is, so that's two ends of the stream.
Many thanks for that. Helmut, I wonder if we can now turn to you for the perhaps wider and more European view, and also maybe any kind of commentary you might feel able to offer on what we've heard from Jacob and Georgia.
Thanks, Jacob. Jonathan, sorry. Actually, I can hardly understand what you say. There's a problem with your microphone. It's just much interrupted. I have to more guess what you're saying, but I kind of bit lip read probably. So no problem.
Switch to a new microphone if you can. Can you hear me?
I don't know whether I'm the only person having this problem, but I can, in fact, while everyone else is very clear, your voice is extremely broken.
Helmut.
Yeah.
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Very quietly.
Now then, what's happening? Can I talk? Jonathan, okay. I can't hear anything now.
How about that?
Ah, that's excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, my name is Helmut Maurer. I'm working for the European Commission, DG Environment, and as a senior legal expert, I'm in this topic of incineration and waste and landfill and infringements for having landfill or not dealing properly with your waste, for illegal exports and whatever you can imagine in aspects with this topic. And I have very attentively listened to Georgia and to Jacob, and I would say, broadly speaking, my heart is with Georgia and my brain is with Jacob, which means Georgia, a lot of what you put forward I've often heard, yet we must differentiate between the theory and the practice, and coming to the European Commission and its policy, and you know it probably very well. The theory is that we want to get away from incineration, and you rightly mentioned the waste hierarchy, and incineration is not at the top of the waste hierarchy, it's rather at the bottom, but it's still above landfill. And we want to recycle more. And when you have followed all the Commission documents in the last years, and particularly this year, the Circular Economy Action Plan #2 and the Green Deal and so on and so on, there's a lot of talk about recycling, or the plastic strategy, for instance. There's a lot of talk about recycling. There's hardly any talk, or there's nearly no talk about incineration. And actually, we're not even giving money anymore to new incineration plants in new countries who want to join the European Union or even member states, regional funding. We want absolutely to prioritize recycling. But, and there's a big but, there's a big problem about recycling. You can want to recycle as much as you like, and you may recycle as much as you like, but you need a market for your recyclate. You need someone who's ready to buy your recyclate. And unfortunately, today what we see is that raw material prices, oil notably, goes down tremendously. Recyclers' business environment has changed dramatically. It's really getting close to impossible to recycle plastic in an economically viable way. Yes, you can, but the mainstream of recyclers, and I'm deliberately saying it's mostly downcyclers, have a difficulty to get the price for their recyclates because recycling is also a very energy intensive process. And coming to the UK in particular, unfortunately the UK, despite having been for so long a member state, has not kept pace with other member states who have solved their landfill problems. Germany in 2006 already had started to close all the landfills for municipal waste. And today there are hardly any running. What we have is landfills that we still care for because they are legacy. And there are about 8-9 countries in the European Union who nearly don't landfill anything. And rightly, in these countries, you have higher recycling rates for various reasons. The thing is complex. Unfortunately, the UK has many landfills and is still landfilling, and this is not a good thing to do. So I'm perfectly on your side that we should not landfill, or rather on the side of Jacob, who is more concerned about landfill and says it's not a good thing. It's better to incinerate. I don't want to talk about landfill, but I just want to make that point that the technique of landfill is anything else but safe. Despite having a European regulation and national regulation that specifies exactly how a landfill should technically be built to be safe, we all know, all landfill technicians will tell you that no one can know what a safe landfill today will look like in 100 years, and it will still be there. And there will be leachate, and there will be water contamination, and God knows. A landfill ceiling becomes unsafe after some time. So these may be time bombs, and all what I want to say is we should do what we can on that level to do absolutely away with landfill. So now we have seen incineration, we have incineration with energy recovery. And that's already a big step forward. We also have, meaning that we, of course, while we are producing also CO2, we're producing also energy. And would we have to substitute that energy we were producing by incinerating waste, we would have to produce that energy by something else, and presumably also by burning fossil fuel. Since we don't have renewable energy in the amount necessary. So it's a slightly not quite straight argument to say that incinerators produce CO2 and therefore they are evil. They are not only producing CO2, they're also producing energy that we need for industrial processes. Okay, fine. I also want to point out that the UK specifically, while you seem to believe that recycling is just what we, if we want to do it, we can do it. It's not quite true. The UK has maybe put less on landfills recently, but has increased considerably its exports of plastic. Its export of plastic to other European countries, to China. Now China has closed the border, and I have figures telling me that in 2018, 356,233 tons, I don't know how exact this is, of plastic waste were exported to developing countries. That is uncivilized behavior. I'm terribly sorry. And I'm not pointing to the UK specifically. All member states and other countries are doing this very same thing. We also find German plastic waste on Malaysian landfills, which are not legally going there. So that is what I want to say, why I put such an emphasis on this, that there's a pressure, what to do with the bloody waste. And the pressure finds very many different valves. And it's absolutely unrealistic to say and to believe that recycling, while being a wonderful process in theory, and even if it was economical, it would be perfect, that recycling is not that valve. for economic reasons, but also for technical reasons and for legal reasons. Why? Look for a definition of recycling. Why do we want to recycle? We want to substitute virgin raw material. But for that purpose, we need to have a certain recycled quality. However, when you look into legislation, you will not find a norm that is encapsulating this qualitative aspect of telling you a recyclate is what suffices a specific quality norm, at least in the Waste Framework Directive, and probably in the UK transposing legislation, you will not find anything more specific. So recycling is a term which is rather blurred and unclear, and often when we say recycling, we actually mean downcycling, which means then in turn that what we get as a recyclate does not substitute virgin raw material. So we're not saving on virgin raw material. So that makes recycling as we have it today look a bit more shady and less a good solution. There's also another aspect. I don't want to be too long, but we have to take into account that in the European concert of member states, we have very different situations. And we have a kind of north-south divide in the north member states that are rather fond of incineration and don't have a littering problem on the other side and don't have landfills on the other side. While in the south, we have enormous littering problems, and the Mediterranean is full of plastic and broken microplastic because of southern Mediterranean countries use the Mediterranean as a waste outlet from their landfills or from discharging directly into waters. That is also a fact of life. And I'm talking about Italy, I'm talking about Greece, and so on. So the situation is much more complex than what it looks. And if the southern Mediterranean countries would not at the same time be very hostile to incineration, they would not have the problem. I'm going to Italy on a conference every year dealing with this complex issue. And what I hear is always the same. Italy has a notorious waste problem, as we know. Also been convicted by the European Court of Justice to pay 40 million euro every year until they do away with bale stored waste that they have in different sites in southern Campania. And no one knows when they will have solved this problem. They're not incinerating because they believe, and this is kind of irrational, I would say, they believe that incinerators pollute, produce CO2, are bad for the climate. But unfortunately, all this vision is unrealistic because it remains as a fact of life that we are over-consuming, we are producing waste, and we need a way to deal in an environmentally sound manner with this waste. If we not landfill it, we need to, and if we also are civilized and don't export it to developing countries and dump it there, then we need to incinerate it. And unfortunately, you know, Germany is known as a kind of maniac of separate collection, curbside collection. A German selects paper, plastic, whatever you can imagine, and puts it in yellow bin from which is designed for packaging, puts it out, and this is collected. Unfortunately, also the very disciplined Germans are not so disciplined. The people dealing with this waste can tell you in these yellow bins, curbside collected, separately collected waste, mainly plastic, about 30% is usable for recycling, but not for upcycling, but for downcycling mostly. I'm talking to an upcycler in Germany who uses about 70,000 tons per year. And he produces virgin equivalent plastic with a very complicated process, mostly polyethylene, polypropylene. And he tells me, I get from this German system 70,000 tons on my yard. And then I sort it again, and I end up with 30,000 tons. And from these 30,000 tons, I make my plastic. And the question is whether this whole process is economic on the other side. Huh? That's another thing.
Helmut, can I ask you to draw to a close within 1 minute? Can you hear me, Helmut?
Yes, yes.
Can you hear me well? Can I ask you to finish within 1 minute?
Yes, no problem, no problem. So I can make a last point, perhaps dealing with Italy and maybe member states, the Western Balkans. There's another phenomenon that we can see, that there's a link between organized crime dealing with waste while earning more than with prostitution or trafficking of people. They earn more with waste, and they're very fond of waste. In southern Italy, the absence of incineration and the abundance of waste gives organized crime a playing field to bring themselves into the game, to say, okay, there's the waste, I deal with it illegally, I dump it somewhere, or whatever, and you pay me and you are get rid of your worry. On what else we see as a recent phenomenon, there are fires, waste, plastic waste notably, 400 incidents of fires in 2018, 300 or more in 2019, the same in 2017 and so on. So what I'm saying this only to shed a light on the fact that things are not that easy, and the waste will always find an outlet, and it's often also illegal trafficking, illegal treatment, or just dumping into rivers and so on, and we have a pollution problem. So for hygienic reasons, last sentence, I would say, and this is my thesis here, I would say that we cannot do in a proper system without incineration. We need to be careful not to have too much of it, because we are binding ourselves for decades, and incinerator today lasts 30 years, and that's an investment that has to pay off as well. So if you do have overcapacities, you have a problem. But if you have undercapacities or no capacities, you have a much bigger problem. And this is not your problem only, it is everyone's problem, because waste discharged illegally into rivers, into the sea, is the world's problem as a whole. Well, that's it.
Okay. Many thanks, Helmut. It seems to me there is a sense in which the three of you agree that there needs to be some level of incineration, and the key disagreement is over just how big that level should be. Is that a fair summary?
I would say, even as an anti-incineration campaigner, I do agree that incineration is part of a waste hierarchy, but we have to talk in terms of reality. And the reality is that waste incineration capacity is growing simply because it is a cheap and easy way to dispose of a massive problem. Regulators and the industry trades on greenwash that this is a climate solution, which it absolutely is not a climate solution. There are many reports out now, which I can quote, that demonstrate that in fact incineration is more harmful than landfill. So I want to address something specifically that the waste incineration lobby and unfortunately Professor Mura just mentioned there, that there is an assumption amongst the general population that we must avoid landfill at all costs. That is not the case. Plastic is not biodegradable. Plastic does not create methane, carbon emissions and methane in landfill. It's inert, and therefore as the mix of plastic in our waste increases, a report out just last week from Zero Waste Scotland demonstrated that given the rising proportion of plastic in the UK's waste, that in a very, very short period, within the next year or so, emissions from incineration will be greater than emissions from landfill per tonne of waste. And that's a fact. That's a peer-reviewed scientific study. So
Julia,
we're trading on old knowledge that's not actually correct.
Sorry, Jonathan, can I, if I may, just make three very quick points. So number one, Georgia says that energy from waste is cheap. It's not as cheap as recycling. So recycling, if you separate material for recycling, that is cheaper to deal with. The gate fees at recycling centres are lower, the charges are lower than the fees to send something for energy from waste. So if you've got something that's recyclable, it's you should be separating, you should be recycling it. That's what the economics should say. The problem is that you're dealing, so my second point is you're dealing with people in the system. And I think this is a lot of what Helmut was referring to. So maybe in theory, 80% of the waste stream is recyclable. The reality is on top of that 20% non-recyclable, that 80%, that's 100% capture of everybody in the country putting all of their recyclable materials in exactly the right bin at exactly the right time.
No, I know you like to blame consumers.
Hold on, guys. Let's just.
The reality is, if you had 90% of people doing the right thing 90% of the time, then that's 80% capture. 80 of 80 is say 64%. But but then you've got process loss. So when you're sorting materials and when you're processing them to turn them back into raw manufacturing inputs, there is process loss along the way. So you can't turn 100%, you know, it doesn't flow through. So there could be 15 to 30% process loss. That puts an upper limit on recycling based on current practices and current technologies and current waste composition.
You're missing the point. You're directly and willfully missing the point.
Sorry, Georgia, I'm really sorry.
Georgia, we'll come back to you in just a minute if you don't mind.
In relation to the Zero Waste Scotland report, that report, they're going to have to issue a correction because they have made fundamental mistakes to their assumptions and to their methodology. They have understated the emissions from landfill and overstated the emissions from energy from waste. And we are certainly looking forward to seeing that correction when it comes out, having spoken.
Jacob, can I come back to a point which really interested me, which I just want, you gave some figures at the end of your talk where you discussed the emissions generated by energy from waste. And if I've calculated correctly, by the time we reach 2025, the CO2 emissions will reach something in the region of 14 million tonnes. And given we have a commitment, let me just finish the question, and then you can tell me whether we've miscalculated. But if we've committed to cut our national emissions to several tens of millions of tonnes, maybe 60 million tonnes by mid-century, then what is now a relatively small part of our national emissions will become a relatively very large part. And that will be, your plants will then be pretty much in their prime and running for some time. So it's a similar problem with aviation. They too have a small level of emissions in comparison with the national total, but huge in what we're trying to, in terms of what we're trying to achieve. How can you manage that by mid-century? Because your attention will definitely focus on you, and you need a good answer to that, really, because essentially this is a long-term issue.
No, absolutely, absolutely, and timescale is very important. So, you know, I mentioned our net zero strategy, and first of all, of course, so based on current technology, you know, that 15 million tonnes roughly that we're sending to EFW is saving 3 million of CO2 relative to the current alternative of landfill. So it's lower carbon now than it otherwise would be. But over time, you're right, we need to do more. So we are working as an industry on our net zero strategy, on a decarbonisation plan. That plan includes a fundamental role for energy from waste in the near term, but it involves making sure that we do more on heat capture, capturing the heat, connecting these plants to heat networks, which greatly boosts the efficiency and greatly reduces the net carbon emissions coming out the top. It involves making sure that plastic, and 60% of the input of the input to these plants is not plastic. We want to drive down even further the amount of plastic going into these plants. We do not want to be burning plastic. So we want to decarbonise the feedstock in the front end, so it essentially becomes a biomass plant. So it's not contributing to fossil-based carbon going into the atmosphere. But in the longer term, we're then thinking about when's the right time to bring in carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and utilisation. In other member states, there are already, I can see George's that doesn't agree with this, but there are pilot projects going on in other member states. And we're also thinking about the role of new technologies that will be able to be brought forward in the longer term. So we have a current fleet of energy from waste plants. By the time we get to the 2030s, those plants, a lot of those plants will start to come to the end of their life. So we're thinking about what will replace those plants in the longer term. Will it be waste to chemicals, waste to airline fuels, gasification plants that put it into the gas grid? So there are all sorts of options. So we're thinking about the long term and driving down those emissions in the long term. But today, based on current technology, this is the lowest carbon option for treating our non-recyclable waste.
Okay, now in a minute we're going to turn to our viewers and listeners and ask if they want to put any questions to you. But Helmut, you set out the problems of waste disposal and waste creation very succinctly. But does the European Commission have a vision, as it were? Do you have a sense of where you want to be by, say, mid-century or the end of century, in context not just of waste disposal, but also of preventing CO2 creation?
Well, actually, yes, indeed. And I'm thinking, I started thinking about all these problems from a waste angle, and how can we do this, and what's the best to do with waste, until I understood that it's not about waste. We're watching, we are trying to solve the problem from the wrong end. We need to look at the products that become waste, which means we have to redesign our products in such a way that they, and when they're plastic as well, that they can be recycled. Jacob said initially, you can't recycle multi-layer plastic. Absolutely right. But why do bloody you have multi-layer plastic? You don't need it. I mean, we are wrapping a piece of cheese for €2 in a multi-layer plastic that can have 12 different polymers. This is unrecyclable. In theory, yes, but in practice, unrecyclable is not economic. Why do we do this? So our vision as a European Union is that we need to look into products. We need to look at the root of the problem, not at the waste. We have to solve waste problems from a product angle. That is a total shift in paradigm. We are totally want to do it totally differently. And we look in the Circular Economy Action Plan too. There's a product policy framework chapter which is in the center of it, and that explains it all. What's going to be done. The vision is that we will have only recyclable plastic, only recycled products, and that we will increase longevity. We will do away with planned obsolescence and so on. That is the vision. How to achieve this is another issue. That's quite a difficult thing. But we need to learn. And here we have talked very arduously about waste. Someone says waste incineration is a wonderful process and we have control of it. Someone else says it's a terrible thing. It has emissions and CO2 and poison. And both have good arguments, but they argue merely from a waste angle. We need to shift away and argue from a product angle, and we need to tackle the problem at its root and avoid to have waste in the first place, increase longevity and so on, and increase recyclability. And then recycling also becomes more economic and much more feasible. And the question, incineration or not, is not on the table anymore.
Okay, and Georgia, we'll just come back to you briefly. I mean, essentially, this is a very insoluble problem, as Helmut says. If you just look at the waste and how you deal with it, and really, waste reduction has to be part of it, I guess. But what's your view on it?
Absolutely does, yeah. I mean, that is something that's something that I definitely agree with the other two on, is that waste reduction has to be the first thing. The issue that we are facing in practical terms, though, is that what drives the system is the economics. And the fact that it is so cheap and easy to get rid of waste in an incinerator means that the economics does not drive any innovation or investment in alternative routes. And so I absolutely agree with what Helmut has said previously about the fact that recycling solutions at the moment, the recycling industry is relatively poor, and that actually there is a dearth of high quality, consistent resin available to make recycled products. Now, that is because there has been a systematic lack of investment in that industry. There is not sufficient investment from the government, and there is not sufficient economic drivers to force innovation in that sector. And that is primarily because we have created an overcapacity of incineration, and we continue to do so. So the UK already, with its operational incinerators in the UK, has enough capacity to deal with its truly residual waste, non-recyclable waste. What we are building now, we are over the next few years doubling our incineration capacity, and that is going to act as an actual blocker to investment in recycling and reduction, because once you build the beast, you have to feed it. And this is what we have seen in other countries. Sweden, for example, has become a net, they import 50% of the waste that they incinerate is imported from other countries, because they have now constructed these incinerators. And actually their recycling and reduction initiatives have been incredibly successful, but it now leaves them with stranded assets where they've invested billions of pounds in new incinerators that they then cannot switch off. So this is what we're facing in the UK. We're doubling our incineration capacity over the next few years, but we already have sufficient capacity for the stuff that can't be recycled. And so we have to start taxing.
Many thanks for that. What we're going to do now is move to the audience and see what views they may have. And I've got a hand up here from Nick Matty, who I'm now going to try to allow to talk. Nick, can you hear us and can you speak? You're muted at the moment.
I can, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes,
You're
I can.
muted at the moment.
Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, my name's Nick Matty. I'm a councillor in London Borough of Sutton, which has got its own incinerator. And I'm also a director of UK Without Incineration. While the arguments about southern European countries where waste is being taken over by criminal enterprise, I don't really think that's really going to be applicable to the debate in England. And what we've got to do is look in England, where we do have sort of fairly stringent laws against criminals moving into waste. And so I think that we can disregard. I mean, there have been some quite hefty prosecutions against people who've been illegally landfilling waste. So if we look,
can I move you on to your question? Would you mind?
oh yes, sorry. Yeah, my question is sorry, I thought it was going to just a general spout here. Sorry, but I do apologise. My general question to everyone is that at the moment, incineration is extremely profitable. Typically in the United Kingdom, if you run an incinerator, you can normally get about £120 a tonne. And if you run a landfill site, you get about £15 a tonne, but then you've got to pay landfill tax. And obviously, this is why the sort of dash for trash is going on. And wouldn't the members, the people taking part today, think that a good way to try and de-incentivise this building all these incinerators would be to introduce an incineration tax, so that people can sort of come to their senses and stop all this building of incinerators, which will overshoot our waste capacity very, very quickly? That's my question. Should we have an incineration tax?
Jacob, I think that sounds like one for you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I mean, the short answer is no. So, I mean, first of all, just very quickly on the waste crime point, waste crime is massive in the UK. It costs about £1 billion a year, and about 2 million tonnes of household and commercial waste leaks into the illegal sector every year. So I think that, that is a relevant point to make. On incineration tax, no, landfill tax was hugely successful. We taxed landfill because we had too much of it. We've got too little energy from waste. Therefore, it would be wrong to introduce a tax on energy from waste. It would be a pass-through to councils that are under extreme budgetary pressures, and it would be council taxpayers that would end up paying higher waste fees. So no, I don't agree at all.
Georgia,
Yeah,
I imagine you might want to say something on that.
Yes, I have 1 or 2 points to make. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's an absolute nonsense. Of course, Jacob would say that. I mean, his members of his environmental services associations make billions of pounds of profit out of incineration. They take a gate fee, they are paid to dispose of waste in incinerators, and they get paid for the electricity that they generate. And so they're paid on every level and they pay no tax. The landfill tax was incredibly positive. It, at the time, the environmental burden needed to be paid. There is a massive environmental and social burden of incineration. Just yesterday, a report was released by the GLA showing the statistics that 15 deaths in London every year are directly attributable to the incinerators currently operating in London. Now, that is a burden of ill health and death. It contributes to asthma. There are the 39 incinerators that reported their statistics in the last year, reported 139 exceedances of their permitted levels of pollutants. Now that is a burden on the health of the nation that should be paid for, and it's been calculated in the Zero Waste Europe reports and the Zero Waste Scotland reports, UK WIN, many other organisations, that the unpaid cost to society from simply the CO2 emissions from the operating incinerators in the UK is over £25 billion over the next 30 years. Now that's an unpaid cost in carbon emissions that other industries have to pay. So why is incineration getting away with it tax-free? Why? There's a burden on society of these emissions, and yet incineration is claiming to be carbon positive, and they simply are not. It is a complete fallacy. So yes, I agree, an incineration tax is a good thing.
Thanks, Georgia. Helmut, tax is a really powerful tool for achieving social change. Your vision of which was largely about reducing the waste entering the system, would tax on the production and use of plastics be part of that vision?
Well, yes, that is a totally different question. A tax on plastic it's about internalization of externalities into products, and we can also apply that to plastics. Would be highly beneficial indeed. But to the incineration tax from a regulator's point of view, I must say yes. Following the polluter pays principle, absolutely there should be a tax also on incineration, not only on landfill, and it would also then be an incentive to reduce or to curb incineration. And I fully agree that it's extremely detrimental for the general public, for the country, for the general public, for every citizen and taxpayer, extremely detrimental to create overcapacities which bind your investment for 20, 30 or maybe longer years. And then you have to, as Georgia said, you have to buy ways to feed your incinerators. But that's mainly a technical and statistical question as to where to draw the line. I'm not sure, but you may know that much better than me as regards England, of course. I'm not sure that the UK has overcapacities in, it may have overcapacity in incineration. I'm also not sure that the UK has incinerators which are not state-of-the-art. That I don't know, but a state-of-the-art incinerator today, and I'm speaking for 75 municipal waste incinerators in Germany, and what the industry tells me, does not have any emissions that you can measure at the chimney. The air at the chimney outlet is cleaner than the air that you suck into the machinery. That's what they tell me. And I've been to some of them, and intuitively...
That's a big claim.
That is a technical question. So,
Yeah.
but tax, yes, but again, extreme care not to create overcapacities. But the question is, and that makes the thing so tricky, where is this line? Where is the overcapacity? And there you have to be very honest with yourselves and not just assuming that the industry just wants to make profits or that NGOs just want to make trouble. No, the truth lies somewhere and everyone must make an effort to find it. But the truth is not incineration is bad, we must not have it. That will not lead to a solution. That is also for certain.
Okay, thank you, Helmut. I'm going to move to another question now from Sue Oppenheimer. Sue, I'm just trying to enable you to speak. I think you're muted. Can you hear me?
Am I unmuted now? Can you hear me?
Good, we can hear you.
Okay. I live in Gloucestershire. I'm part of a campaign against our local incinerator here. What I wanted to talk about was really the lack of regulation and the duplicity, really, of the incineration industry in trying to increase their profits at the cost of better processes for recycling waste. So our incinerator, amazingly, the local council pays £189 a tonne for the first 108,000 tonnes of waste per annum that they send to the waste incinerator. Beyond that, any tonne of waste that they send there is only charged at £16 a tonne, which means that it's much cheaper to burn the waste than it is to recycle it. Also, commercial waste, third-party waste, is only charged at £60 a tonne because it is subsidised by the £189 that the council is paying. And the company that runs the incinerator has just launched a commercial and industrial collection service to collect what we know is approximately 75% recyclable waste from commercial enterprises locally, on the basis that it's an environmental and green solution for them because they will get green energy out of burning plastic. My question really...
So, yeah, if you can move to your question, I'd be very grateful.
My question really is that shouldn't there be more regulation to prevent that kind of abuse of commercial power over local authorities and over what's right for achieving climate change objectives?
Okay, so thanks for that, Sue. I'm going to ask all three panelists to answer the questions. We'll try and get 2 or 3 more in, so please try and be as quick as you can. Georgia, do you want to? I imagine you're going to fully agree with Sue on this one, but do give us a quick review.
I'll give you a quick agreement. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see problems here with our local authorities and the way that the whole system is rigged against good waste management practices. So very much, as Sue says, the similar practices that happen in the London Borough of Enfield is that schools, local authority housing, blocks of flats, businesses have to pay extra for recycling. And so, of course, we're in a tough economic times. So businesses, what's the first thing you're going to cut? Extra payments to do your recycling. My kids' school, the primary school, they have to pay extra for recycling. They don't have the budget. And so all of their waste goes into their black bins, which all goes straight into the incinerator. Local authority housing doesn't get recycling bins. And so it goes on. And so at source, consumers, residents are not being given the opportunity, and the economic system is stacked against doing the right thing. So everything that Jacob has said about his members trying to reduce their carbon emissions, when you look at the economics of the system, that tells a very, very different story.
Yeah. Jacob, essentially you are doers, and the things you are doing are controlled by the regulations passed by government. And so, in a sense, you are doing what you've been asked by politicians in power some 20 years ago. What do you think of the points Sue made, and what would you rather be seeing, if anything, in place of the current system?
So, yeah, so I guess two quick points in response. I think the first point is that, I mean, I won't comment on Sue's specific example, but I mean, I think best practice in terms of a contract between a long-term contract between a council and a contractor for running an energy from waste plant, best practice is that it should be structured in a way to incentivize more recycling. And there are plenty of examples of that. So you structure it so that the council is incentivized to divert as much material away from the plant and into recycling options. And that leads me on to my second point. And, you know, I think that there are sort of elements of agreement that I would have with Georgia, but because what I would say is, I think what we really need to do is get the economics of recycling right. The big problem for recycling has been a lack of end markets and a lack of certainty around end markets for recycling, for products from recycling. What we have seen recently is a couple of years ago, the Chancellor announced a new plastics tax, £200 per tonne tax on plastic packaging that doesn't have 30% recycled content. What that has been transformational for plastic recycling in the UK and has led to a wave of investment in new plastic processing facilities in the UK, because all of a sudden the producers and the manufacturers of plastic packaging actually want to use recycled polymers. They want recycled content in their products. So they are now willing to enter into long-term contracts on the back end to secure recycled content for their plastic packaging. And that has been transformational. And we want to see more of that. And we want to see more effort going into boosting the economics and improving the economics of recycling. And there are a lot of initiatives that are forthcoming from the government under its resources and waste strategy. A lot of it due to come in around 2023 onwards. And all of that should really help to boost recycling. And that is our priority as the industry.
Okay. Helmut, very briefly, because I'm going to try and squeeze 2 more quick questions in.
Yes, indeed.
How would you respond to?
When I hear that in the UK, in some regions, you have to pay for recycling, I'm wondering whether I hear well. Of course, you cannot make someone pay for recycling. You need to incentivize recycling. You're disincentivizing recycling if you make people pay. And where the system is attuned in a proper way, where the recyclates are separately collected and you do not pay, but you're also not paid, but you do at least not pay. And then you have residual waste, like we have it here. I have 4 waste bins here, and I put anything I have to in my residual waste bin. And this is going to incineration. But you would not believe me. I pay per year 50 euro for emptying and doing away with my residual waste. In my household, in north of Bavaria, in Germany, it's not totally cheap to live there. I pay only 50 euro for the residual waste because the system is tuned in a way that anything that is possibly recyclable is steered away. I do not pay for that, and I end up with residual waste, which is extremely little. So that is one thing. Then green public procurement. That is an enormous tool that every state has in its hands. Just to give you a figure of the magnitude, in Germany we have 350 to 500 billion euro investment every year into public procurement. So public procurement is a tool where one could say, as a state, okay, public procurers have to buy only material that contains 30% of plastic recyclate, etc., and you would have an enormous boost for the recycling industry. We are going into this direction in the European Union, but it will take some time, and it is something that UK can do as well, and which would be very clever to do, I think. And public-private partnership is something, if you build an incinerator in public-private partnership, that's a dangerous thing, because then you deliver your municipality or whoever is the partner of this to economic processes that you cannot steer fully, and that doesn't sell politically very well. I would not do that. In Germany, I think we do not have it at all. Maybe we have it, I don't know. But there are municipal waste incinerators. They belong to the people, the incinerators, and they don't absolutely have to be profitable if they can't be profitable. So you have a different method.
Helmut, we've got 2 questions. One from Shlomo Doan. Hope I've pronounced that correctly, and one from Stuart Britton. I'm going to ask both of you to put your questions as briefly as you can, and then we'll do one final round of the panelists and just go through the issues you raised. Stuart, we'll come to you first. I think you're muted. Can you hear me, Stuart?
Yes, I can now, thank you. I want to ask the panel.
Stuart, can you introduce yourself, please, first of all?
Sorry, I am, you can simply take me as a member of the public, no more. And you'll understand from my question why. What, I wonder, emphasis does the panel place on public education? Rubbish and waste collection is, for most of us, a very boring issue. For you, it's very specialist. Most of us want to know as little as possible about it. Now, we will soon have an enormous amount of unemployment, particularly youth unemployment. If you could, if it were possible to give school leavers or university leavers 1 week of visiting plants and learning about these things at the end of their school or university courses, optional may be, it would not only educate them, but it would surely get those involved in the professional disposal of waste thinking about addressing the public. So it's not so boring in the future. By the way, none of you have been boring at all.
Thank you, Stuart. Shlomo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine, Jonathan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's great. So again, I wanted to, given we're running close to our deadline, but we can carry on for a bit longer. I wonder if I could ask you to put a brief question as well.
Very good. Okay, cards on the table. Jacob will know me as well as Georgia. I'm the national coordinator of the United Kingdom Without Incineration Network. So I'm representing an environmental NGO. I've framed the question for Jacob, but I've got spin-offs for Helmut and Georgia as well. So Jacob spoke earlier about the Environmental Services Association working with NGOs. And I'm wondering if the ESA is prepared to enter into a constructive dialogue with UK Wind regarding resource and waste policy. Will the ESA be publishing data on their members' incinerators? For example, quantities of gross CO2 emitted per incinerator per year, the feedstock composition that these facilities use. Helmut talked about how these are, if you like, incinerators that belong to the people, even if the contractual arrangements mean that they are not operated by the people. They are certainly in our country as citizens. We have an interest not only in the CO2 and in the feedstock composition, but we also have an interest in the contract. So Jacob also spoke about how contracts should be structured in a way that incentivizes recycling. Let's see the contracts. Let's have that sort of information available. For Helmut, I'm wondering if the Eurostat data is something that he's satisfied with the quality of, or if he also thinks that there's scope for better waste data across Europe for all member states. And for Georgia, I'm wondering what challenges she's encountering when it comes to trying to get factual information about CO2 emitted per incinerator, about feedstock composition, about the waste contracts that are associated, and all of the financial details. So that's
okay, Shlomo, thanks for that. It's a long question, but it seems to be essentially about getting information about how waste plants are operating and how they are paid. Is that a fair summary? Can you hear me, Shlomo? Maybe not. Right, Georgia, I think it would be interesting to hear your personal view on the access to information and data that Shlomo put, and your response to Stuart's question about educating people to change behaviour.
Yeah, so first off, in response to Shlomo, I mean, thankfully, he and UK Win are incredibly helpful as a source of information. They labour intensely to try and obtain as much information as possible and make sense of it, because unfortunately the waste industry and the local authorities and these contracts are incredibly opaque, and it's very difficult to get information. And so yes, I agree with Shlomo's frustration, clearly, that it's difficult to get the information, and therefore makes it very tricky to assess. However, it is brilliant that now we are getting a flurry of peer-reviewed scientific studies demonstrating the data that shows us what we already suspected to be the case, which is that the CO2 emissions from this particular route of waste disposal is far more than it should be, and we need to start regulating it properly. And then in answer to Stuart's question, I would say yes. I mean, God, I completely get where you're coming from. Waste is boring as anything can be, and particularly I think because the waste industry makes it deliberately opaque and deliberately difficult, and you get into things like biogenic and fossil CO2 and all kinds of really hugely technical, mind-bending things very quickly. It shouldn't be. It's supposed to be about resources. It's supposed to be about you know, frugality and about doing the right thing with waste. I love it when people want to find out about the waste industry, and I do everything that I personally can to educate people as much as possible and try and get them interested in it. And I definitely think, unfortunately, there's a huge amount of greenwash out there from the waste industry. I do wish that they would engage properly in the waste debate and tell people more. And I guess that goes back to Shlomo's point about the availability of actual reliable data. One of the just very, very quickly back on that point about emissions data is the fact that you have what we call the biogenic fudge. You know, it's this thing about where you can offset half of the CO2 because it's biogenic, not fossil, you know, and there's all kinds of tricks in accounting, carbon accounting, that the incineration industry uses to try and portray a green image, and that's incredibly unhelpful to further the debate. So if Jacob and his members are honest about wanting to be part of the climate emergency solutions, they ought to be more open with their data and be working together with the public.
Yeah. Helmut, same questions to you, I think, because essentially this issue of data is obviously, as Stuart suggested, part of the boringness, but it's also crucial to understanding. Are you happy with the data you're getting, and how can we use it to change people's behavior and thinking?
Well, Shlomo asked about whether I was happy with Eurostat data. I'm never happy with any data, even Eurostat data, but that's the best we have, and so I have to be happy with it. I think they are broadly reliable, but as a general problem that we encounter specifically in waste, Eurostat's not running around and levying the data themselves. They ask member states to give the data to them, and if data are not correct, then Eurostat cannot dispose of correct data. So that's as simple as that. And in the waste business, truth is probably one of the first victims sometimes. So there has to be caution in this. Another point that was highlighted first about education and whether waste was boring. Education is extremely crucial. Waste is by far not anything boring. It's something that every pupil, every young person should be educated about, because it's about the future of the planet. It's about how we do go about with resources, whether we are wasteful with the resources or whether we deal with them responsible. That has to do with who are we as consumers and what's our responsibility in that game. It's easy to say, oh, the incinerators are doing bad. Oh, they're landfilling. Oh, there's waste. Oh, this waste hasn't been taken away. It's ultimately each individual which is at the root cause of the problem and his behavior. Why do I producing waste? That is always the first question every citizen is confronted with and has to be confronted with. And this has to be made subject to people in discussion. And the best way to do that is school, and pupils are always very interested in this. They also need to be told that waste issues are human rights issues. They're global issues. And by no means waste is something isolated, dealing with figures and having nothing to do with them. It's quite the opposite.
Okay, many thanks for that, Helmut. Jacob, yesterday the chairman of the Environment Agency gave a very interesting speech where they talked about the impact of emissions in general on the planet, and cited a figure which you hear increasingly now from very bodies that are normally very staid, like the Met Office, when she basically said we're heading for 3.9 to 4 degrees of warming by the latter half of the century. And the Met Office has produced figures talking about maybe 5 or 6 degrees by 2100. And looking back, I have to say that all the estimates I've seen on CO2 emissions and their consequences have turned out to be often underestimates of the real impacts. But at the same time, the climate debate has shifted in a way. It's shifted from being about science initially 20 years ago. People were disputing the science, and then it moves on to technologies and ideas like shifting to nuclear energy or geoengineering and so on. But strikingly, the whole climate debate has shifted very much now into accountancy. How do you measure where carbon comes from? Who's producing it and how are they producing it? And I can see the waste industry's dilemma. You're in a sense a product of regulation by politicians. But if you are producing 11 million tons of CO2 or 14 million tons of CO2 in 20 or 30 years' time, will you have, and this is casting back to both Shlomo's question and Stuart's, will you regard yourself as having succeeded in not in actually achieving anything for reducing the impact of waste on the planet? And I'd just refer you back to Shlomo's question about data in your answer, and his question about accessibility to it, and also Stuart's question about changing people's thinking and behavior. How do we reconcile those many conflicting pressures, and where do you see the waste industry adjusting to what is going to be as Georgia described, a climate emergency?
Yeah, so thank you, Jonathan. So, I mean, right up top, I mentioned that one of our key strategic objectives as an industry is how we decarbonize. You know, I pointed to the fact that we've reduced our emissions as an industry by something like 70% since 1990. You know, that is we are one of the best performing sectors historically at having reduced our carbon emissions in the last couple of decades. You know, so that's where we've got to. We recognize we need to do a lot more. You know, we want to reduce, you know, the emissions from we have a big fleet of vehicles. We want to use zero emission vehicles. We want to decarbonize our fleets. We want to decarbonize the plant and machinery we use. We want to decarbonize all of our operations, and we want to do that in a staged and pragmatic manner that's deliverable over the next 10, 20, 30 years, so that we make our full contribution towards net zero. And that is absolutely fundamentally what we're committed to. So if in 30 years we're still emitting the same amount of CO2 as an industry that we are in aggregate as we are today, then yeah, that would have been a failure. So absolutely, we're completely committed to reducing our emissions. In terms of the data, a lot of this is publicly available. I mean, Shlomo will know that the Environment Agency really closely monitors all of our facilities. A lot of our members will have real-time information that they broadcast on the emissions as they come out of the stack for different pollutants. You know, some of our members actually have that live information running all the time. They report to the Environment Agency. The Environment Agency has all of that data and information and publishes. You know, the CO2 emissions will be in the pollution inventory that's published by the Environment Agency. And we are, as Shlomo will also know, there are new, even more stringent regulations coming in on air pollutants that have been introduced at an EU level on air pollutants that are allowed to come out of energy from waste plants. And we are working with the Environment Agency to make sure that there is proper, clear, transparent reporting on all of these, so that there is the transparency that everyone would like to see. And then just briefly on the education point, you know, it's absolutely fundamental to us, education and simple, clear communication to the public, because you know, we rely on people to do the right thing, to put the right materials in the right bins, in the right containers. We have little control over our supply chain. We have to take what comes out, you know, what's presented to us by people and businesses. So helping them as much as we can to do the right thing is absolutely fundamental to us. And it's one of the reasons why we run visitor centres and education centres at our facilities all around the country.
Okay, many thanks, Jacob. We're going to have to wrap up now, I'm afraid, but what I'd like to do is do one last quick round and ask you each for if you can come up with the 1 or 2 key policy changes you'd like to see that would help us reach agreement and move to a place where essentially this issue becomes less of an issue. So Georgia, if you had a minister right in front of you right now, what would your 2 key demands be?
I hope to in the High Court in a couple of months' time. So I'm taking the Secretary of State for Bays to the High Court on the challenge of CO2 emissions from incineration.
So count that. Yeah.
I want incineration taxed. I want it taxed appropriately for the pollution that it creates, so that it drives innovation in other waste areas. I'd also like to prevent, I mean, I hear what Jacob says about all of their ambitions towards net zero, but yet how can he explain the huge amount of lobbying and interference in policy and regulation to prevent the huge growth of incineration, to prevent recycling innovation, to prevent tighter regulation on incineration. So it's fine for him to say we want to be part of the solution, whilst
Georgia, we just want 2 quick policy points here.
Yeah. Well, preventing waste industry lobbying from having such an influence over the expansion of incineration and the increased taxation of incineration.
Okay, Jacob.
Yeah, so on the number 1 on the front end, more funding for councils to separate materials for recycling, and then on the back end, stronger action on creating markets for recycled materials. So mandatory recycled content in packaging and products.
Okay, many thanks, Jacob. And Helmut.
Well, I heard prevention very often, but it was always used in the wrong context, or in a context where it hadn't been the right place. Prevention is the key. And I would plead that you concentrate all your knowledge, your intelligence, and your effort and your heart on this very topic as a country, and do what you can in order to improve waste prevention. And this means also then including the public, and also including infrastructure that the public needs to be part of this game, waste prevention. When it comes to curbside collection, unthinkable that from one borough to the other, you either do co-mingled and or strictly separately collected. You have to have one bloody system in the whole country, which is consistent, logical, and understandable by everybody, every citizen. And they just need to follow this. And this will also lead then to better recyclability, to avoiding cross-contamination of plastics and other materials that don't belong together, and so on. There's a lot to be done. And get out of the ditch and concentrating on the malicious incineration industry, or concentrating on the guys who attack the waste. We are talking about our common problems here, and we have to be together part of the solution. And the solution is definitely concentrating our intelligence on waste prevention, all what we can do. And that is a much better investment than perhaps engaging too strongly. I'm not disencouraging this as a lawyer, too strongly into lawsuits, because before law, in law courts, it's like being on high sea. You never know what's coming out of it. It's often. Okay, so I think this is indeed what I could give you.
So Helmut, I think you may have achieved a degree of reconciliation, because you finished on 2 points I suspect we might all agree on, which is one, to minimise the production of waste, and secondly, to avoid lawyers.
You can come to me then when I practice again.
Okay, so I think we've now run out of time, so many thanks to all three of you. And I think one of the key points that emerges from this is that we're looking at this at a British level, but it's really an international problem. And that makes it a particularly relevant issue to have been hosted by the Frontline Club, which is essentially a venue for overseas and foreign journalists. So many thanks to the Frontline Club as well. And with that, I think we're going to conclude now. And best wishes to you all. Many thanks again. And thanks to all our attendees.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everyone.
See you. Bye.